in all
things.
What I'm going to take away from this experience is the things that I learned and probably just how I saw God in all things.
The highlight of the gathering was probably the mass events. They were a lot of fun, just seeing God work in so many people all at once.
And something I'll take away from this experience is me being able to realize that I can express my faith to people even if they aren't Christian.
I think the highlight of the gathering was just being there in general, to be completely honest, because the mass events were always really fun.
Honestly, everybody here was kind of not feeling the best. Maybe some people showed up messed up, broken, and that's how I saw God in all things, was Him fixing those cracks and repairing the brokenness.
What I will be taking away from this gathering is that Jesus is found in the most unexpected places.
I saw God in all things, like specifically in the band, how we all united together to be able to play the concert so well in only 3 days of rehearsal. And more generally, I saw in how everybody came in just to unite in the mass events to like clap along and sing and all that stuff.
I truly felt God in all things. And
Thank you for your support.
Thank you, Concordia.
Thank you for all your support.
I would like to point out that I did say thank you, but the clip just did not make it into the video.
There was an audio issue.
Yeah, Casey.
Well, good morning. In all things. This was the theme for this year's National Youth Gathering in Houston, Texas, just a few short weeks ago. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with what the National Youth Gathering is, and sometimes it's called the NYG, so if I refer to it as that, now you know. It's a week-long experience put on by the LCMS every 3 years. And at this event, youth from all over the country, all over the world for that matter, come together for worship, for Bible study, to serve, and so much more. As we just saw in this video a couple seconds ago, we as a church here at Concordia, we had the privilege of bringing some of our youth to this wonderful event. So I know you guys are kind of spread out, so why don't you stand real quick so everyone can see your wonderful faces. And yeah, let's give them a round of applause. So this was such a cool event in many different ways, and we just want to say thank you to the congregation for all your support through prayers, financially, that got us there. We could not have done this without y'all's help. So first, I just want to ask, has anyone here ever attended as a youth gathering? Okay, we got some hands there. How about as an adult? Have any of you gone to volunteer at a youth gathering? Got a couple. How about this? Parents, have you ever sent one of your youth to a youth gathering? Yeah, so we've all in some way have experience with what this is. But the thing is, if you've never been a part of this experience, first I want to say I'm sorry. And second, it can be a little difficult to kind of encapsulate what this actually is through pictures and video because they just can't do it justice. But imagine this. You're sitting in a stadium and slowly it starts to fill up, row by row, section by section, and it just doesn't stop. The people keep coming in, and the whole stadium fills up with teens and adults, 20,000 strong, singing, dancing, laughing, and worshiping our great God. It's truly an amazing thing to witness in person, and something that is, again, just lost in the photos and the videos. There's no way that they can do justice to what this experience is like. You can literally feel God's presence and how the Holy Spirit is working through everyone that you encounter. And for me, it's a clear glimpse of what heaven is going to be like. It's a taste of what is to come when all the saints from all of time come together before the throne of God to worship Him. The gathering. It truly is a once-in-a-lifetime, life-changing event. And I should know, the fact that I'm standing here today is a testament to this. This was my 6th gathering. I was actually blessed as a youth to go 2 times, and now 4 times leading other youth. And the NYG has really impacted my life. It's helped shape my faith, but also it is one of the factors that led me going into full-time church work. And the cool part is, now that I'm a minister myself, again, I have the honor and the privilege to take other youth on the same journey that I went through and get to watch how the gathering changes their lives as well. As we just saw and witnessed in this video, our youth, they had an amazing time. They worshiped, they served in many different ways. One of the days we put together Braille books for those in need. Our very own Alex played French horn in the symphony at one of the worship services. And we learned a lot during this gathering. And I know this trip had an impact on their lives. But not just their lives here and now. No, this gathering will be ingrained in their memories forever. And it will be a part of them. And they will continue to grow in their faith. The seeds that were planted that week will bear fruit throughout their entire lives. Because this gathering is now a part of their faith story. As they enter this next school year, or as they begin college, remembering who they are and to whom they belong, this experience will have exponential returns for God's kingdom. Because now that they have been changed, they now get to share their renewed faith and bring change to the lives to everyone that they meet. I am very proud of this group that we just took, and I'm excited to see how they will take this experience, go out into the entire world, and share Christ's story. In all things. Again, that was the theme for this year's National Youth Gathering. And today's sermon, I kind of want to spend some time unpacking what this simple phrase actually means. But first, to understand this theme, I think we first must understand the importance of story. We all love a good story, right? Well, that's because God has actually designed us to use stories as a way to help us make sense of this crazy world that we live in. Stories help us create order. They offer a plot, a beginning, middle, and end. Stories also reveal who we are. They tell us why we're here, and they tell us where we're going, because they give us purpose and meaning. But most importantly, our individual stories help us see that we're actually part of an even larger story. You could say it's the story of all of humanity, but for us as Christians, we can easily see that our larger story is actually God's story, as revealed to us through His holy word and in Jesus Christ. In other words, the Bible is the narrative of our lives, the story of all things. But unfortunately, we find ourselves living in a world where we have competing stories. A large part of the gathering, we found ourselves focusing on the fact that our culture likes to tell us that we can, pick and choose which story we want to be a part of. There's not just one single overarching story that connects all people together. But the truth is, as believers, we know that there's only one true story, and it encompasses all things. And that story is centered on the gospel of Jesus Christ. In all things. This theme is based on Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. And in his letter to the Colossians, Paul reminds the church of the supremacy of Christ in all things. We know this because Paul uses the phrase all things at least 7 times in these few verses. You see, believers in the town of Colossae, they had a very similar problem as we do in our culture today. They too had competing stories. At that time, many false teachers began to infiltrate the church, and they started teaching many Gnostic beliefs about Jesus. They claimed that Jesus was not the only way to salvation. They believed that there were hidden stories that you could look to, and this ultimately diminished Christ's importance and his glory and that of the Christian narrative. And so with the similarities of competing stories in the early church and with our own world today, I believe that this passage has a lot to teach us about how we can faithfully hold fast to the promise that Jesus is not only the center of our story, but in him, his story it holds all things together. So let's dive in and look at this text. As always, I encourage you to grab a Bible if you have one near you. If you're using a Pew Bible, it can be found on page 1832. So again, we're in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, and that is where we're going to begin. So here's what it says. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So Christ's supremacy is over all things, including our past. This section reminds us that the story of all things begins, well, at the beginning, with creation. Paul's writing here in many ways echoes what we hear in John 1. Jesus was with God in the beginning. He was God, and through him all things were made. But in verse 17, Paul also points out to us that Jesus was in all things even before creation. That is, his rule and his reign, it predates creation. We know that Adam and Eve, and therefore all of mankind, were created in the image of God. But Paul says here that Jesus is the image of God, an important distinction because it places Jesus above all of created things, and it boldly declares that he is God. So personally, as I read these verses, phrases like, of all things visible and invisible, it reminds me of the words of the Nicene Creed. Paul is simply professing the same thing that we confess whenever we say that creed, that Jesus is God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. Christ's supremacy is in all things because his story begins before all things. We now live in a relationship with him because he came to us and he continues to preserve and to sustain all things. And because of this, we have a promise that in him all things will hold together, including the church and our world today. Let's continue reading. Let's pick back up at verse 18. It says, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. So Christ's supremacy, once again, is over all things, including our present. This verse reminds us of the unique relationship that Christ has with us today through his church. Paul writes that he is the head of the church. You see, in many of Paul's writings, he uses this figurative language, often referencing the church as a body with many different parts that must work together to accomplish things. But every time he uses this illustration, he always points out that Christ is the head. Our bodies, they do not work without a head, and therefore the church cannot work without Christ. We are dependent on Christ for everything. The head controls the functions of the body, and Christ, as the head of the church, controls its function as well. It is through him that he rules, governs, and causes the church to grow and have life. Through the cross, though, Jesus has won our salvation. He has achieved this through his life, his death, and his resurrection. He is the firstborn among the dead, and this is the promise that we too are going to have a new life in him. Christ's supremacy is in all things because his story still affects us here today. We now live in a relationship with him because he came to reconcile us and all of creation to God. And because of this, we have a promise in him that all things hold together, and we have a promise that he will come again. So let's close out this section, picking back up at verse 19. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on a cross. See, Christ's supremacy is over all things, and that includes our future. This section reminds us of how Christ has reconciled all things through his sacrifice for us on the cross. Many would point to the moment of salvation as an event that happened sometime in the past. But in actuality, this reconciliation actually points to our future. Christ's work on the cross was a one-time event, yes, but it also is a promise of the life that is to come. Christ is in all things, and he will continue to be in all things, even into the end of the age. Jesus has come to restore what has been lost, to make peace between God and all of creation. The hope of the gospel is that we have eternal life through Christ's death, and we have been set apart for his sake. We were created in him. We have new creation through him in our baptism, and we will be recreated by him as well. Christ's supremacy is in all things, and his story points to our future. We have a new life in him, and because of this, we have the promise that in him all things hold together, a promise that spans all of time and space, past, present, and future. Christ is in all things. And this passage from Colossians, it helps us resist the temptation of the competing narratives that we see in our culture today. We do not get to pick and choose which story that we want to be a part of because Christ's story has chosen us. Christ is in all things. His story is the story of all things. And now, his story is our story. Our lives are now just a living testimony to the story of all things. The only story that tells us who we are, why we're here, gives us our purpose, and most importantly, it tells us where we are going. And this story is only found in and through Christ. For me, one of the coolest parts about this passage is actually in verse 17, where it says, "And in him all things hold together." At first, you might not catch this, but the word that is used there, hold, it actually has a very significant meaning. It's a verb that we would call a perfect tense, meaning that it applies past, present, and future. Meaning that in this context, he's saying that Christ, he has held all things together, which is the past, that he still holds all things together even today, the present, and he will continue to hold things for all of time, the future. How cool is that? We have a God who became incarnate, made in flesh through Jesus, and has come to redeem us, to sustain us, to rule and reign over us, but also to unite us, to reconcile us, to give us a hope and a future. He is the one who holds all things together. He is the one who has reconciled all things, and he is the one who has redeemed all things. Through his blood on the cross, he has made peace and traded his life for yours. Sin no longer has a hold on us because his grace holds us now. Through his word and sacrament, he has come for you. He is here with you, and he will hold you. His story, it is our story, and it is the story that we share with the whole world, that Jesus is in all things, now and forevermore. And all God's people said, Amen.